"Occupant, step out of the cabin with your hands visible." The voice hit like a thunderclap, metallic, stretched thin through a bullhorn that echoed off the frozen lake. For a second, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard the rotor whine of a drone and the crunch of boots in snow. Blue and red light pulsed across the log walls like lightning trapped in glass. I sat up in my bunk, heart steady but slow, like it was waiting for instructions. The window beside me glowed red for a moment, then blue again. Through the frost I could see movement, figures, shadows, the shape of a patrol SUV nosing up the trail. "Sir, step outside now," another voice barked. "Keep your hands where we can see them." That's when I noticed the drone hovering above my porch, its lens gleaming like a mechanical eye. I'd seen one of those things at a county demo last year. Now it buzzed over the antlers I'd hung on the beam, a hunting relic from some other life. The beam shook faintly from the downdraft. Down the slope, beneath the floodlight haze, stood a small cluster of neighbors bundled in parkas. One of them, small frame, snowflake pattern hood, was talking into her phone with frantic energy. Even from this distance, I recognized Karen Whitmore, the president of our homeowners association, queen of the clipboard and self-appointed guardian of order in Ravens Hollow Preserve. "Yes, officer," she said, voice carrying over the still air. "That's him, the man inside. He's armed with rustic energy." Rustic energy. That's a new one, I thought. Next to her, three of her allies, people who still wave like we're all in a Norman Rockwell painting, stood with their phones up, recording the scene as if Netflix might buy the footage later. Their breath fogged in the light like small factory exhausts. I swung my legs off the bunk and reached for the wool sweater draped over a chair. The air was brittle, the kind of cold that scours thought. Somewhere out on the lake, the ice cracked with a sound like distant thunder. For a moment I listened to it instead of the bullhorn, wishing the world would go back to ordinary winter noises. "Sir, we're not going to ask again." Their voices bounced between the pines. I could see the faint shimmer of snow dust kicked up by tires on the access road. Whoever had called this in must have made it sound serious. SWAT serious. I muttered, half to myself, "You've really done it this time, Karen." The radio outside crackled, distorted words cutting through static. "Suspect may be armed. Single occupant confirmed. Thermal shows movement." Armed, sure. The only weapon in the cabin was a hatchet, hanging quietly on the wall beside my fishing rods, behaving itself, as always. I eased to the window, careful not to make sudden silhouettes. The deputies were forming a line near the tree line, rifles angled low but ready. Their headlights carved long shadows through the snowdrifts that reached almost to my porch steps. "Evening sure took a turn," I whispered, fogging the glass. Behind the patrol cars, Karen shifted from foot to foot, her visor flashing under the lights. She wasn't afraid. She was thrilled. You could see it in the tilt of her chin. This was her moment of validation. The proof that all those reports and observations meant something after all. One of the neighbors, Dan Rooker, the one who still owes me a ladder, asked her something I couldn't hear. She pointed toward my cabin and mouthed, "He's dangerous." I couldn't help but smile. Dangerous was a stretch for a man wearing wool socks and half reading a book on trout ecosystems. The drone tilted, its red eye centering on me. Somewhere, an officer muttered into his mic. I took a slow breath. Every sound carried tonight, the ticking of my wall clock, the drone's hum, the slight whistle through the window frame. I remembered training sessions from years ago, back when I taught community officers how to handle hostile caller cases. Funny how lessons you write for others come back to test you. All right, I thought, let's make this safe for everyone. I reached for my jacket hanging near the door, slid my wallet into the front pocket, and unzipped a plastic bag containing the cabin's deed, kept handy for nosy visitors. Outside, a voice shouted again. "Occupant, step out slowly," I called back, calm as a snowfield. "All right, deputies, stepping out now." The moment I opened the door, the night's breath hit me like glass dust. Floodlights flared. Shadows of rifles jittered on the snow. I raised my hands slowly, the bagged deed dangling from one. My voice carried steady. "I'm Nolan Graves. This is my cabin, and I'd appreciate it if we could talk before someone freezes to death." There was a pause. Confusion, murmurs, maybe realization that the suspect sounded more polite than dangerous. The only one not hesitating was Karen Whitmore, standing on the hill, phone still in hand, whispering excitedly to whoever she thought was listening. For a long beat, Everything was still. Me under the lights, them in the dark, Karen watching like she'd caught Bigfoot trespassing on HOA property. Then I heard the first deputy's uncertain reply through the cold. "Sir, can you repeat your name?" And I did, slowly, clearly, so they could spell it later in the report that was about to change everything. "Nolan Graves," I said, "Deputy Attorney General for Common Interest Communities." The night seemed to inhale. No one spoke. Even the drone hovered higher, as if giving me space. And that's how it began. The quiet man in the cabin, the woman with the clipboard, and a winter night that turned an HOA complaint into a full-blown raid. They lowered their rifles a few inches, like men waking from a shared mistake. I could see their eyes behind the frost on their visors, confused, wary, but listening now. The young deputy who had spoken first stepped closer, his breath turning to fog in the beam of his flashlight. "Deputy Attorney General?" he repeated, like he wasn't sure those words could exist in a log cabin at the edge of nowhere. "That's right," I said quietly. "For common interest communities." He blinked. Then to his radio, "Dispatch, stand by for confirmation." Static, then a woman's voice came back. "Confirmed. Nolan Graves, Deputy Attorney General, State Office." You could feel the tension leak out of the air. The lights didn't dim, but the danger did. For a long second, nobody moved. Then the deputy muttered a low, "Jesus," under his breath and gave the faintest shake of his head. I didn't gloat. That's never been my style. I just let the silence hang there, long enough for everyone, including Karen Whitmore, to realize what they'd done. When they finally holstered their weapons and backed away, I stepped off the porch and let the cold bite through my wool socks. The snow squeaked underfoot, the kind of sound that carries memory. Down the hill, Karen froze in place like she'd just realized the punchline was about her. "Mrs. Whitmore," I called, calm and even. "You can hang up the phone now." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Just a faint puff of vapor, like the last bit of warmth leaving an argument. The deputies apologized. One offered to help fix the window the stray bullet had cracked. I told them not to worry. Paperwork would do more repair than wood glue tonight. After they drove off, the forest went still again. The only light came from the moon, and the steady red blink of that drone still circling above the treetops, as if reluctant to admit the show was over. I stood there for a while, watching my breath rise in slow clouds. Then I went back inside. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it, calm, quiet, and smelling faintly of cedar smoke and black coffee. A half-read book about trout ecology sat open on the table. The radio on the shelf whispered the weather report. Wind chill advisory, frost overnight, small craft warning for a lake that had been frozen solid for 6 weeks. I shut it off. The silence that followed was the kind I liked. Honest, heavy, and without judgment. People assume cabins are lonely places. They're not, if you know how to listen. The pines talk when the wind's right. The lake shifts and sighs beneath the ice. Even the stove has a voice, low and steady, reminding you that warmth still exists in the world if you know how to feed it. That's why I bought this place 6 years ago, because peace had become a rare currency. In my day job, I swim through a swamp of complaints, bylaws, and neighborhood feuds that start with property lines and end with lawsuits. HOA presidents who think their clipboard is a badge, boards that confuse rules with power. I'd seen every flavor of it. That's why I keep this cabin, because here, the only bylaws are written by wind and pine needles. I spend weekends chopping wood, drinking from a chipped enamel mug older than some of the attorneys in my office, and pretending the world outside the tree line doesn't exist. It's a good arrangement, or it was, until Karen Whitmore moved in one lot over. She arrived a year after I did, with a smile so tight it could seal envelopes and a voice that carried across the lake like an Amber Alert at 3 a.m. Within 6 months, she'd made herself president of the HOA, chair of the compliance committee, and moral compass of Ravens Hollow. I didn't think much of it. I just waved when she waved. But for people like Karen, silence isn't neutrality, it's provocation. And my silence, it seems, had been loud enough to keep her up at night. Now, as I sat back in the wooden chair and looked at the bullet hole in the window, I realized something simple and cold. She'd finally found a way to make noise loud enough for the whole county to hear. Outside, the wind pushed against the door, rattling it softly. It seemed safely, like it wanted to come in and warn me that peace here was about to end, for good. I first met Karen Whitmore the way you meet a cold draft, by accident, and too early in the morning. It was late spring, a Saturday, the kind of morning when the lake's still silver and the loons are half awake. I was stacking firewood along the north wall when I heard tires crunching over gravel. A silver crossover rolled up my drive and stopped like it had found a crime scene. Karen stepped out wearing a pink windbreaker, spotless white sneakers, and a visor that caught the sun like a warning flare. She carried a clipboard pressed to her chest, the way a rookie cop might hold a badge. "Good morning," she said, smiling without meaning it. "You must be Mr. Graves." "Guilty," I said. She nodded briskly, scanning the cabin with the precision of a surveyor. "Beautiful place you've got here. Rustic. Very expressive. That's one word for it. I'm the new HOA president," she said, as if announcing a royal title. "We're conducting a quick compliance check for visual uniformity." I looked around. The nearest cabin was 200 yards away. "Uniformity?" "Yes," she said, tapping her clipboard. "The board voted to implement a frontier rustic palette last month. Your stain color isn't on it." "It's cedar," I said, "same as the Miller place." She frowned, as though I'd quoted scripture incorrectly. "Mr. Miller applied for retroactive approval. Did you?" "I didn't know I needed permission to match the trees." Her smile tightened another notch. "Well, now you do." That was my introduction to the woman who would, over time, measure my life one citation at a time. The letters started showing up a week later, heavy paper with watermark and the HOA logo embossed in blue. The first one said my cabin's finish violated harmonic aesthetic guidelines. The second said my shoreline hammock exceeded setback allowances by 3.7 feet. I checked the rulebook. The setback applied to permanent structures. Hammocks, last I checked, don't require foundations. Letter number 3 accused me of harboring unapproved wildlife occupancy. Apparently, the barred owl that nested under my eaves had not filed the proper forms. Then came a citation for stacked firewood evoking disrepair. I'd stacked it clean and level, but she claimed it was visible from the access road and created an impression of decay. By the time the 5th notice arrived, quiet hour violation for organic odors, after I brewed coffee on the porch at dawn, I started saving every piece of paper. Something told me I'd need them someday. A few weeks later, I caught her pacing near my property line with a laser distance meter, the kind used in construction. She didn't see me at first. She was crouched by the woodpile, muttering measurements, her visor tilted like a radar dish. I stepped out onto the porch. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Lose something?" She startled, but recovered fast. "Just verifying compliance." "Compliance with what, exactly?" She looked at her notes. "Your firewood's proximity to the lot boundary." I nodded toward the 2 pines that marked the edge. "It's 5 feet inside the line." She measured again. 4.9. "Close enough for government work," I said. She didn't smile. "I don't work for the government." "Lucky you," I said, and went back inside. Through the window, I saw her take photos from 3 angles, kneel, measure again, and finally retreat to her car. Her taillights glowed red through the mist, like the exit lights at the end of a bad dream. Neighbors started warning me quietly. "She's got a group chat," one told me. "They call it Lake Watch. She posts screenshots of your chimney smoke." Another sent me a screenshot. Karen's message captioned, "Possible illegal Airbnb activity." The photo was my brother's car parked outside for a weekend visit. That's when I stopped laughing. Silence, I realized, tasted like victory to people like me, but to people like her, it tasted like gasoline. Every time I ignored her, she just poured more fuel on the fire. I didn't know it yet, but that fire was about to light up the whole valley. You can always tell when paranoia graduates into a full-time job. For Karen Whitmore, that promotion came sometime in midsummer. It started with the group chat. She called it Lake Watch, a cheerful name for something that operated more like a low-budget intelligence agency. They traded screenshots, theories, and photos like Cold War analysts studying satellite images. My chimney smoke became suspicious emissions. My truck in the driveway on a weekday was possible squatter activity. One post read, "He's unloading boxes, maybe stockpiling." The boxes were groceries. I'd bought enough chili and coffee to survive a 2-week storm. Apparently, preparedness was now subversive. At first, I thought it was funny. I'd seen HOA drama before, board members feuding over mailbox colors, neighbors filing noise complaints against cicadas. But this was new territory. There was something about Karen's obsession that hummed beneath the surface, like a power line in fog. Then one evening, the humming got louder. I was splitting kindling behind the cabin when I heard voices on the gravel path. Two men, both middle-aged, both wearing matching fleece jackets embroidered with the HOA logo, were walking toward my porch with clipboards in hand. "Afternoon," I called. "Can I help you?" The taller one smiled, the kind of smile people practice in mirrors. "Mr. Graves, we're the compliance volunteers for Ravens Hollow. Quick inspection." "Inspection?" I leaned on the axe handle. "Didn't know we were running a prison camp." He chuckled nervously. "Just routine, sir. We're checking structures for adherence to Section 14B, non-permanent improvements." "Non-permanent improvements," I repeated. "That a new one?" "Mrs. Whitmore authorized it last week." "Of course she did. They asked to walk around back. I told them no. Property lines still meant something in this state." One of them muttered, "He's being uncooperative," like he was dictating for a report. "Gentlemen," I said evenly, "if you're going to play compliance, bring real badges next time." They left, but not before snapping photos. I watched them trudge back down the trail, their footprints already filling with dust. The whole thing took 5 minutes, but it left a chill that stayed all evening. A few days later, a certified envelope arrived. The return address, County Zoning Office. Inside was a formal complaint, filed by the HOA, claiming I had built an unpermitted auxiliary structure behind my cabin. They even included photographs. The structure in question, a wood-drying rack, 2 posts and a crossbeam, exactly 4 feet tall, holding split logs. I could have built it blindfolded. Apparently, Karen considered it a fortress. I drove to the county office the next morning, showed them the original site plan and photos. The zoning officer, a man named Doug, with a beard like a snow shovel, looked at the paperwork, looked at me, and sighed. "Mr. Graves, this is the 3rd one this month," he said. "Same complainant. She ever get tired?" He smirked. "Doesn't look like it, but don't worry, we're tossing it. You're fine." Before I left, he added, "You must have really got under her skin." "By existing," I said. "It's a common crime." By August, Lake Watch had grown into a full neighborhood operation. They held patrol walks around sunset, snapping photos of driveways, boats, even mailboxes. Once I spotted Karen crouched behind a pine tree, whispering into her phone while measuring something with a tape reel. When I called out, "Need a hand?" she straightened so fast she nearly lost her visor. "Just verifying setback distances," she said. "For what? The horizon?" She didn't answer. Her expression was the same one bureaucrats get when a law refuses to bend for them, tight, pale, offended by gravity. That's when I started documenting everything. Emails, letters, timestamps, every knock on the door. I installed a small camera above the porch, motion activated. Nothing fancy, just enough to remember what truth looked like when people started rewriting it. The footage came in handy 2 weeks later. One night, around 9, my truck headlights caught something glinting near the cabin. 2 shapes ducked behind the propane tank. I cut the engine and watched. It was the same pair of compliance volunteers from before. One held a clipboard, the other a camera. They crept around back, whispering. I didn't say a word, just let the camera record. When they left, I reviewed the clip. Grainy but clear enough to see their faces, the HOA logo, and one man pointing at the window saying, "We'll show her this." That was the night I stopped laughing completely. You can ignore a lot of things in life, noise, gossip, even malice. But when people start showing up at your door with cameras and excuses, you realize the line between nuisance and danger is thinner than you think. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, she was manufacturing evidence. Every time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Each letter came with more legal language, more threats about consequences for non-compliance. I recognized half the wording. I'd written the original statutes years ago. There's a special kind of irony in being targeted by your own legislation. Still, I kept quiet, let her think I was ignoring her. Because silence, in the right hands, isn't surrender, it's strategy. But by fall, I could sense something coming. The emails grew frantic. The group chat screenshots I received from sympathetic neighbors sounded unhinged. Phrases like, "We need to make the county act," the kind of phrasing that never ends well. I'd seen enough legal train wrecks to know the next step wouldn't be a letter or a photo. It would be a phone call. And I was right. You never forget the sound of a gunshot you didn't deserve. That lesson came to me long before Karen Whitmore ever picked up her phone. It was 4 years ago, in another county, another winter. Back then, I was still splitting my time between state hearings and late-night briefings. I worked with a man named Eli Parsons, a good attorney, good father, and the kind of person who believed in the system even when it didn't believe back. He was handling a zoning dispute that had turned ugly, an HOA president who wanted to seize a neighbor's lot for landscape integrity. The resident pushed back. Then, one night, someone called 911. The report said an armed suspect was barricaded inside. They sent a full tactical unit. Only problem was, the man inside wasn't armed. He was sleeping. And Eli was with him, reviewing case documents by lamplight. When the breach came, it was chaos and surround sound. Flashlights, shouts, glass, boots, confusion. A single officer's trigger finger twitched in the noise. One bullet. Eli never made it out of that house. I arrived an hour later to help identify the scene for internal review. The officers were pale, shaking. The caller had been the HOA president herself. She'd misunderstood a threat. Her voice on the tape was calm, almost proud, like she thought she'd prevented something terrible instead of causing it. That night, standing under red and blue lights that didn't fade, I made myself a promise. If panic ever came knocking on my door, I'd never let it decide the outcome. That promise has a way of echoing in you. It changes how you breathe, how you move, how you speak when others are shouting. When the deputies showed up outside my cabin months later, bullhorns, drones, the whole carnival, I remembered Eli. I remembered how fast fear rewrites truth. That's why, when I heard occupant, step out with your hands visible, I didn't argue. I slowed my heartbeat, narrated every movement. I'm reaching for my ID now. You don't survive a misunderstanding by being right. You survive it by being predictable. Sometimes, control isn't about power, it's about restraint. People like Karen mistake noise for authority. They think yelling loud enough makes them safe. But the louder fear gets, the less room there is for sense. And once you've seen how that ends, you can't unsee it. After Eli's death, I pushed for reform. Our office created a protocol for swatting incidents, cross-verification, secondary checks, psychological assessment for false reporters. We built a system to protect people from hysteria dressed as concern. Irony, I suppose, that the man who helped write those rules would one day be on the receiving end of a fake emergency call. Life's good at closing circles. Some just take longer than others. That winter night in Ravens Hollow, I sat in my chair long after the deputies left. The wood stove hissed, the wind scratched at the window, and I watched my breath fade into the room's dim light. The house was warm, but the air inside me wasn't. I thought of Eli's wife, who still sends Christmas cards to my office every year. She always signs them the same way, for what you're still fighting for. I poured myself coffee from the thermos, stared at the steam curling up through the bullet hole in the window, and whispered to no one in particular. Don't worry, Eli, I'm still fighting for it. It happened on a Saturday, cold, clear, and quiet. The kind of winter night that makes even sound hesitate before crossing the lake. I'd spent the day shoveling snow, fixing a draft under the kitchen window, and reading a dog-eared book about river restoration. By 9 o'clock, I'd eaten canned chili straight from the pot and poured one last cup of coffee before turning in. The radio whispered weather updates, frost warnings through Sunday, and somewhere in the woods, an owl called once, low and distant. That was all the company I wanted, or thought I had. Down the hill, Karen Whitmore stood on her porch, phone in hand, breath pluming in the cold. Her visor was gone, replaced by a knit hat pulled tight over her hair. In the pale wash of her floodlight, she could see the faint glow from my cabin window. To her, it looked suspicious, like proof of something she'd been warning everyone about. She'd been on Lake Watch chat all week, talking about unregistered tenants and possible illegal rentals. Every time I parked my truck, she made a note. Every light, every sound, cataloged, magnified, rewritten. Now, she whispered into the phone camera, he's there again. I told you he never leaves that place. Nobody should be here this time of year. A neighbor texted back, maybe he lives there full time? Karen's reply came fast. Not legally. I checked the county database. Something's off. What was off, apparently, was that I existed outside her control. At 9:27 p.m., she dialed 911. The dispatcher's transcript later read like a play written by fear. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man in a vacant cabin near Cedar Wolf Lake. He's armed, I think. He threatened me earlier this week. Can you describe the weapon? It looked like an axe or a hatchet. He carries it around. He was pacing, muttering things. I think he's dangerous. She added pauses between sentences, fake breaths for effect. You could hear paper rustling, probably her HOA letterhead sitting right beside the phone. Ma'am, are you in danger right now? Yes, I can see him through the window. He's talking to himself. I wasn't talking to myself. I was humming to a song on the radio while washing the dinner pot. By 9:35, the call had been logged as possible armed squatter, prior threat alleged. Dispatch pinged 3 deputies and a drone operator. The system spun up like a slot machine hitting jackpot. Lights, sirens, adrenaline. Meanwhile, I rinsed the coffee cup and watched snow begin to fall again, soft and slow. If peace had a sound, that was it, the faint hush of winter breathing. I turned down the lamp and glanced at the window. Something red blinked once through the frost, then again. That's when I knew something was wrong. At first, I thought it was a snowmobile taillight. Then I heard the engine hum, not steady like a sled, but high-pitched, mechanical. A drone. Its red beacon hovered above the roofline, scanning the porch. Outside, tires crunched on the frozen road. Headlights bounced off the trees. The quiet night suddenly filled with motion. I turned off the radio and stood perfectly still. Old instincts took over. Steady breathing, low heart rate, mind clear. A bullhorn cracked the silence. Occupant, step out of the cabin with your hands visible. It wasn't the voice of curiosity. It was command, urgent, rehearsed. I moved to the window. Blue and red lights painted the snowdrifts like a fever dream. 3 patrol SUVs, forming a semicircle around my driveway. And behind them, a familiar figure wrapped in a snowflake print parka, phone pressed to her ear, whispering like she was orchestrating a symphony. Even through the stormlight, I could see her excitement. Not fear, excitement, like the moment before a curtain rises. The deputies spread out, rifles low but ready. I could hear their boots scraping against ice. The shuffle of someone loading a taser cartridge. Someone radioed, "Subject moving inside." That was me, walking from the kitchen to the front door, trying not to trip over the rug. The first thing you learn from a swatting case, move slow, narrate everything, and let reason find you later. I called out through the door. All right, deputies, I'm coming out slowly, hands visible. I zipped my ID and property deed into a plastic sleeve, the same one I kept for Karen's paperwork, poetic in a way. Then I opened the door. The cold hit like broken glass. Floodlights cut through the dark, blinding. I raised my hands, the deed bag dangling. Evening, officers, I said. I'm Nolan Graves, the owner of this cabin. One deputy hesitated. Sir, step forward, slowly. I did. Each crunch of snow sounded louder than breath. Behind the SUVs, Karen whispered into her phone again, feeding the fire she'd started. That's him. He's pretending to cooperate. Be careful. But something shifted. The deputy shone his flashlight on my wallet, the badge tucked behind my license. You could see realization flicker across his face. He lifted his radio. Dispatch, confirm. Deputy Attorney General Graves? The reply came back through the static. Confirmed. Stand down. And just like that, the temperature changed. Not the air, but the tension. Karen's face drained of color, like frost melting off tin. I could have said a lot in that moment. But I just looked at her and said the only thing that mattered. You really should have read the fine print. For a few long seconds, everything froze. The deputies, the lights, even the wind through the pines. I could hear my own pulse, steady and distant, like a clock buried under snow. The young deputy in front of me blinked, his flashlight beam trembling just slightly on my coat. Sir, he said, voice tight with disbelief. You're the Deputy Attorney General? That's right, I said softly. For common interest communities. He hesitated, then turned toward the others. Hold position, he ordered. Everyone hold. Behind him, one of the older officers shifted his weight. And that's when it happened. A muffled slip, a curse, and then the sharp crack of a rifle hitting ice. The gun fired. The sound tore through the night like the sky splitting in two. I flinched, purely by reflex, as the bullet zipped past my shoulder and punched through the front window of my cabin. Inside, something metallic clanged. The coffee pot. Steam burst out through the hole like the place had exhaled in shock. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the deputy who'd slipped shouted, "Accidental discharge!" The radio exploded with noise, commands, swearing, overlapping static. I stood perfectly still. The young deputy, the one who had spoken first, took a slow step toward me, eyes wide. "Sir, are you hit?" I shook my head. "I'm fine. Pot's dead, though." Even in that cold, he smiled, just a flicker, and then he exhaled like someone who'd been holding his breath for a week. He keyed his radio. "No injuries. Repeat, no injuries. Lower your weapons." One by one, the barrels dipped. The drone hovering above us tilted away, its red light sweeping over the snow like an embarrassed apology. Down the hill, I saw Karen Whitmore freeze mid-sentence, her phone still pressed to her ear. From where I stood, she looked smaller than ever, one hand clutching her clipboard like it might protect her from gravity. "Sir," the deputy said, "we had a call from a Mrs. Whitmore reporting a possible armed trespasser. Said you'd threatened her." I kept my tone calm. "She's mistaken. I live here, own the property outright. You'll find my deed right here." I lifted the plastic bag slowly, letting the flashlight catch the embossed seal. He took it with gloved hands, examined the address, then my license. When he looked up again, the realization was complete, like watching a computer reboot in human form. He swallowed hard. "Dispatch, we've got confirmation. This is legitimate property ownership. Repeat, legitimate." Static crackled, then the dispatcher's voice returned, lower this time. "Confirmed. Mr. Graves is state-level DOJ. Proceed with de-escalation." I could hear one of the other deputies mutter, "Oh, hell," under his breath. I turned slightly, enough to see the cluster of neighbors still filming. Their phones were shaking now. Karen's wasn't. Hers was steady. She wasn't filming anymore. She was deleting. I started walking toward her, slow, deliberate, keeping my hands visible just to make everyone comfortable. The deputies didn't stop me. They knew the air had already changed sides. When I reached the bottom of the slope, she tried to speak first. "Mr. Graves," she began, "this was all a misunderstanding. We just wanted to ensure community safety." "Community safety?" I cut in, voice still even. "You called in an armed suspect report, Mrs. Whitmore. That's not safety. That's a trigger waiting for gravity." She swallowed. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You always mean for things to go far," I said. "That's what people like you call thorough." For once, she didn't have a comeback. The visor she always wore wasn't there tonight, just her eyes, wide and uncertain, like she was seeing herself reflected in something she didn't recognize. The deputies regrouped near their vehicles. One of them, a grizzled sergeant with frost in his beard, walked over and extended a hand. "Sir, sorry for the chaos. We respond to calls as they come in. Protocol, you know." "I know," I said. "You did your job." "She didn't." He nodded slowly. "We'll file it right. You want us to take a statement tonight?" "Tomorrow," I said, "when everyone's fingers can feel again." He smiled faintly, tipped his hat, and turned back to his men. Engines started, doors slammed. The lights dimmed from chaos to normal. The snow had stopped falling, but flakes still hung in the air like suspended dust. I stood there until the last SUV turned down the access road. The silence that followed was deep, too deep. Karen lingered a moment longer, her breath fogging in quick, shallow bursts. Finally, she spoke, voice small but sharp. "You could have just cooperated from the start." I looked at her, then at the bullet hole in my window, and said, "I did. The question is, why didn't you?" She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, her boots crunching against the frozen gravel, clipboard pressed tight to her chest like a confession she couldn't unsign. Back inside, the cabin smelled faintly of coffee and gunpowder. The bullet had missed the thermos by half an inch, lodged itself in the wood paneling above the stove. I left it there, evidence, a punctuation mark at the end of Karen's hysteria. I poured what was left of the coffee, cold and bitter now, and sat by the fire. The stove popped, the logs shifted, and the world finally remembered how to be still again. Outside, the drone's light blinked once more before fading into the trees. For a moment, I imagined Eli Parsons sitting across from me, raising an eyebrow like he used to. the unspoken question between us both. Yeah, I thought. I heard it too. That sound of almost. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours writing down everything. Times, names, words, faces. Every story needs a record before it becomes someone else's version. And as I wrote, I realized something simple and absolute. Karen, or any of them, never think they're villains. They think they're the last line of defense between order and chaos. What they never understand is, sometimes they are the chaos. Morning arrived the way guilt does, quiet, gray, and unwilling to look me in the eye. The patrol tracks were still in the driveway, frozen into the ruts like scars that wouldn't melt. My porch was littered with footprints, casings, and a single glove someone forgot in the confusion. The drone was gone, but its echo still hummed in the back of my mind. I poured coffee into a cracked enamel mug and stood at the window. The bullet hole above the stove whistled faintly when the wind hit it just right. Outside, the snow glittered under a cold sun, smooth and bright, as if nothing had ever happened. That's the strange thing about peace. It's terrible at telling the truth. I watched the lake for a long time. No police lights now, no neighbors lurking behind curtains, no Karen pacing at the bottom of the hill, just quiet. Too much of it. I thought about how close that bullet had come, about Eli Parsons, about the way history repeats itself when you don't file the paperwork to stop it. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. The first line I wrote was the date. The second line was the time of the call. By the 10th line, it looked less like a diary and more like an affidavit. I recorded everything, the words shouted through the bullhorn, the sound of the gunshot, the sequence of commands, even the way the flashlight trembled when they realized who I was. Every detail mattered. Memory is reliable only when you give it ink. I saved the body cam footage link. One of the deputies texted me later that morning. He'd written only 2 words, "For the record. Good man." Then I backed up all the videos from my porch camera, the compliance volunteers, their night visit, the drone footage that still hovered in the sheriff's report. I filed them under a new folder. Whitmore Incident, Preliminary. It wasn't anger that drove me, it was habit. In my line of work, you learn that justice doesn't begin with outrage. It begins with documentation. You fight hysteria with paper. You win wars with timestamps. Around noon, a county cruiser rolled up my drive. The same young deputy from the night before stepped out, face pink from the cold. He looked older already, maybe from sleep deprivation, maybe from realizing how close things had come. "Morning, sir," he said. "Morning," I replied. "Hell of a night." He nodded, eyes down. "Yes, sir. We've cleared the report. Dispatch confirmed false call. You'll get a copy when it's filed." "Good," I said. "File it clean. No need to dramatize." He hesitated. "Sir, for what it's worth, I'm sorry." I gave him a small smile. "Not your fault. You did your job. Someone else decided to play yours." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded again, then left. After he drove off, I stood on the porch and looked down the road toward Karen's cabin. Her driveway was empty. No car, no movement. For a woman who liked to measure everything, she'd suddenly run out of tape. The air smelled faintly of pine and gun oil. I took one last sip of coffee, then opened the folder on my laptop and scrolled through the files. Evidence, evidence, evidence. The trick isn't in finding it, it's in knowing when to use it. I closed the lid, leaned back in the chair, and watched a single snowflake drift through the bullet hole and melt on the table. There was stillness again, but not peace. Peace has a heartbeat. This was something colder. Every mess has fingerprints if you know where to dust. By Monday morning, I'd already filed a preliminary report with the Attorney General's office. I wasn't looking for revenge, just accountability and maybe a little sanity. The investigation began quietly. Emails, message logs, dispatch transcripts. I'd lived long enough in the legal trenches to know truth doesn't shout, it hides in metadata. The first thing that stood out was timing. Karen's 911 call came exactly 12 minutes after a message in the Lake Watch group chat. The message wasn't from her. It was from someone named A. Mercer. I'd seen that name before. Alan Mercer, former HOA attorney, once licensed in 2 states, disbarred for procedural malfeasance. The kind of polite wording the Bar Association uses when someone lies professionally. He used to draft compliance manuals for HOAs across the county. I remembered his signature footnotes, overwritten, pompous, desperate to sound constitutional. When I saw his name in the chat logs, I knew what I was looking at. The ghost of a man who still thought he ran the world one bylaw at a time. I pulled every document I could find. Turns out Mercer and Karen had been emailing for months. She called him Alan, he called her Madam Chair. Their correspondence was a masterpiece of mutual delusion. One message read, "If we make enough noise, the county will have to act. The key is urgency. Get others to corroborate your concerns." Another, "Frame it as community defense. Never say personal dispute. You'll lose sympathy." They weren't neighbors keeping order. They were conspirators rehearsing a play called Authority. I printed the emails, highlighted dates, cross-referenced the timestamps with Karen's group messages. Each time she posted something paranoid in Lake Watch, Mercer replied within the hour with strategic advice. He was feeding her scripts, phrases designed to sound official, legal, even patriotic. Suspected transient, public safety concern, potential domestic threat. Those weren't her words, they were his. The man behind the curtain of a one-woman show. The irony? Mercer was already on my radar years ago. He'd lost his license after drafting fake citations under an HOA seal, charging residents for unauthorized landscaping that didn't exist. I'd signed the memo recommending his disbarment. And now, here he was, back in the game, using Karen Whitmore as his marionette. By Wednesday, our office had enough to open a formal ethics review. I didn't need to push it. The facts walked themselves to the door. The county's IT team traced Mercer's emails to a computer registered under a consulting firm, Community Compliance Advisors. No tax record, no incorporation papers. It was a shell, just like the rules he built. The investigator assigned to me, a sharp woman named Lisa Nguyen, summarized it perfectly. So the HOA president who weaponized 911 got her playbook from the guy you once shut down. Full circle, I said. Lisa gave a small smile. You have a talent for attracting poetic justice, Mr. Graves. We subpoenaed the 911 call log, attached the Lake Watch chat screenshots, and requested the HOA's internal records. That's when the real surprise landed. The HOA's official rulebook, the one Karen had been waving around for years, had a hidden edit. Page 4, Section 3, Emergency Protocol. The clause read, "In the event of a perceived safety threat, the board president is empowered to contact local law enforcement on behalf of all residents." That phrase, "on behalf of all residents," had been inserted 3 months earlier by Alan Mercer. It was a legal shield, meant to protect Karen from liability if her call went wrong. He'd planned the whole thing. When I finished reading, I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. It wasn't just paranoia, it was policy. A system designed for abuse, masquerading as procedure. I stared at the bullet hole above the stove, while the printer spat out page after page of proof. If Mercer wanted noise, he was about to get it, just not the kind he liked. 2 days later, the county prosecutor called. "Gerald Hoffman," he said, his voice dry as old paper. "Heard you've got quite the file. Stack's growing by the hour," he chuckled. "Mercer and Whitmore, I should have known. You want me to make it official? False reporting, criminal harassment, accessory before the fact," I said. "Let's put it in ink." "Done," he said. "Been waiting years to nail that man. Thanks for handing me the hammer." That night, as I shut down the laptop, I looked out at the frozen lake again. The moonlight traced the old snowmobile tracks that led nowhere. Somewhere out there, an owl called again, the same barred owl Karen once tried to evict. I smiled. Nature doesn't read bylaws, it just survives them. They called an emergency meeting 2 weeks later. Technically, it was Karen's idea, an attempt to clear the air, but once the county prosecutor got involved, the agenda changed. The email invitation said, "Mandatory attendance for all residents of Ravens Hollow Preserve," which is HOA language for show up or risk missing the fireworks. The meeting was held in the lodge, the same one Karen used for her annual Compliance Appreciation Brunch. I'd been in that room before, pine-paneled walls, elk heads, a coffee urn that hadn't been cleaned since the Bush administration. But that night, it looked different, too bright, too quiet, like everyone knew something was about to end. When I walked in, conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned in their folding chairs. Karen sat up front at the long oak table, posture stiff, hands clasped over a thick binder. The visor was back. The clipboard, too. armor of a sort. Next to her sat two board members and a man I recognized immediately, Alan Mercer. He had that lawyer's look, tan from golf, tie slightly too loud, smile one notch too wide. For a man recently under investigation, he looked surprisingly comfortable. Maybe he thought the rules still worked for him. He was about to find out they didn't. The county prosecutor, Gerald Hoffman, stood near the projector. He was a big man with the voice of a tired preacher and the soul of a patient executioner. He opened the meeting with a single line. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we'll be reviewing the truth behind the Whitmore incident." A murmur spread through the room. Karen adjusted her visor. Mercer leaned back, smirking faintly, as if confident his rehearsed narrative would hold. Gerald nodded toward me. "Mr. Graves, would you like to begin?" I stepped forward, my breath fogged slightly in the chill air. The projector screen behind me flickered to life. The first video was from a body cam. Timestamp, January 14th, 21:42 hours. You could hear the wind, the bullhorn, the commands. "Occupant, step out of the cabin with your hands visible." Bang, the accidental discharge. "No injuries, lower your weapons." The footage paused right after the gunshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Good Lord." Another muttered, "That could have killed him." I turned slightly toward Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is the part where you were hiding behind a snowblower, coaching witnesses. Recognize your voice?" She said nothing. Gerald pressed play again. "Tell them you heard militia radio," her voice hissed on the tape. "Remember militia radio?" People in the audience turned toward her. Neighbors who had lived beside her for years, now staring like they'd never seen her before. Karen straightened, tried to regain footing. "I was acting in the best interest of the community." Gerald cut her off. "Ma'am, best interest doesn't include fabrication of criminal conduct." Next clip, the 911 call recording. Her voice again, trembling but calculated. "He's armed. He threatened me with a hatchet." Silence in the room, except the faint hum of the projector fan. I said quietly, "For reference, the hatchet in question was sitting on a shelf next to my fishing gear, behaving itself." Laughter broke out. Not mean laughter, just the kind that releases pressure. Karen flushed. Mercer leaned in to whisper something to her, but I caught the movement and raised my hand slightly. "Mr. Mercer," I said, "good to see you again. Still drafting legal templates for fake HOAs?" He froze. The projector changed slides. Emails filled the screen. Headers, dates, addresses. Lisa Nguyen had formatted them neatly. From Alan Mercer, HOAConsulting.com to Karen Whitmore at rhpboard.org. Subject, strategy, urgency, and framing. And below it, his words, "If we make enough noise, the county will have to act." Gasps again. A few residents turned to stare at Mercer like he'd just confessed to tax fraud on live television. I stepped closer to the screen. This is the man who wrote the language that triggered the 911 call, a disbarred attorney coaching a volunteer HOA president to misuse emergency services. Gerald's voice rolled in. "And that's not all." He clicked to the next slide, a scanned page from the HOA handbook. Highlighted section, Emergency Protocol, Section 3. The board president is empowered to contact law enforcement on behalf of all residents. Inserted, Gerald said, by Mr. Mercer, 3 months ago. No board vote, no record. You could hear the air leave the room. Even the coffee urn stopped percolating. Karen's face went through every shade of red known to man. Her voice cracked. "This is persecution. I was protecting property values." I smiled faintly. "By calling in a SWAT team on a sleeping neighbor." She slammed her binder shut. "I did what any responsible president would have done." "Responsible?" I said. "The HOA covenants you've been enforcing, every fine, every citation, they lapsed 5 years ago. The association failed to renew its filing. You've been governing under a ghost charter, Mrs. Whitmore." For a long second, nobody spoke. Then someone dropped a fork from the refreshment table. The sound hit like a gunshot in a church. Gerald delivered the closing lines with quiet precision. "Effective immediately, Ravens Hollow HOA is under state supervision. A full financial audit will be conducted. Board elections will be rerun. Civil penalties totaling $47,000 will be imposed to cover damages and legal costs." Mercer started to speak, but Gerald raised a hand. "And Mr. Mercer, you are under investigation for unauthorized legal practice." I suggest you find a new hobby. Karen tried to protest one last time, her voice cracking like thin ice. This is unfair. I was trying to maintain standards. Gerald looked at her over his glasses. Ma'am, you weaponized law enforcement against a homeowner who was sleeping. The only standard that matters here is the law. Her mouth opened again, then closed. The visor slipped forward and clattered onto the table. The sound echoed longer than it should have. When the meeting ended, people didn't talk much. Some avoided looking at me. Others came over quietly, shaking my hand like I'd just disarmed a bomb. Maybe I had. As I stepped outside, the night air hit crisp and clean. Snow fell in slow spirals. Down the hill, someone had unplugged the Christmas lights still hanging on Karen's porch. The valley felt lighter, quieter, like the place had exhaled for the first time in years. I looked up at the dark ridge and said softly, "That's one rule finally worth enforcing." The courthouse in Cedar County isn't much to look at. A square brick building, a flag out front, and the faint smell of old coffee drifting from the clerk's office. But that morning, it looked different, like justice had finally decided to show up in person. Karen Whitmore sat at the defense table, hands folded so tightly her knuckles matched the paper in front of her. The visor was gone this time, so was the clipboard, just a plain blue blazer, a trembling pen, and eyes that couldn't find anywhere safe to rest. Next to her sat Alan Mercer, wearing a tailored suit and a smirk that looked rehearsed. His attorney was whispering something, probably the legal equivalent of, "You might want to start praying." The county prosecutor, Gerald Hoffman, stood across from them, flipping through a binder thick enough to level a table. He didn't look smug. He looked tired, but the kind of tired that comes right before satisfaction. The judge entered, old school type, white hair, half-moon glasses, voice like gravel and thunder. He adjusted his robe, scanned the docket, and said, "State of Cedar County versus Karen Whitmore and Alan Mercer. Charges, false reporting to law enforcement, attempted swatting, criminal harassment, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The words hung in the air like snow about to fall. Karen's attorney rose. "Your Honor, my client deeply regrets." The judge raised a hand. "Save it for sentencing." Gerald began his statement. He laid out the timeline, the messages, the doctored HOA rulebook, the 911 call, the body cam footage. Each piece clicked into place like stones on a frozen lake. When the recording of the call played, you could have heard a snowflake land. Karen's voice trembled from the speakers. "He's armed. He threatened me with a hatchet." Then Gerald paused, turned to the judge, and said, "Your Honor, the only hatchet present that evening was hanging on a wall, inanimate, compliant, and entirely unthreatening." Even the bailiff almost smiled. Then came Mercer's turn. Gerald displayed his emails. Every line, every manipulation, every strategic suggestion. He read aloud the phrase, "If we make enough noise, the county will have to act." Mercer shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. When the prosecutor mentioned his disbarment, the judge raised his eyebrows. "You've done this before, Mr. Mercer?" Mercer tried to speak. "Your Honor, that was a civil misunderstanding." The judge cut him off. "You forged law. That's not a misunderstanding, that's malpractice with ambition." The courtroom chuckled, quietly but unanimously. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. I described the night, the noise, the cold, the way the deputies' lights painted my walls blue and red. I told them about the bullet that missed my shoulder and the silence afterward. Then I said, "Your Honor, I don't blame the deputies. They acted on what they were told, but Mrs. Whitmore weaponized fear. And fear, once unleashed, doesn't stop where you aim it. It just keeps moving until it hits something living." The judge didn't take notes. He just looked at me, not the way a judge looks at a witness, but the way a man looks at another man who's telling the truth. The verdict didn't take long. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they came back, the foreman stood and said, "We find both defendants guilty on all counts." The courtroom exhaled. It wasn't celebration exactly, more like relief. Karen's head dropped. Mercer sat rigid, jaw clenched so tight his teeth might have cracked. The judge cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, stand please." She rose slowly, as if her legs had forgotten how. "You misused emergency services," he said, voice steady but heavy. "You endangered innocent lives, falsified claims, and instructed others to lie. The law is not your weapon. It's your restraint. And you cut that leash yourself." He flipped a page on his notes. "Therefore, I sentence you to 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service with the state park's trail crew, 5 years prohibition from serving on any homeowners association board, and restitution of $6,300 for emergency response costs. Karen's lips trembled. Your Honor, I was just trying to maintain standards. He lowered his glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, you tried to maintain control. There's a difference. She sat down hard. The sound of the chair scraping the floor was the only applause she got. Then came Mercer. The judge's tone changed, colder, sharper. Mr. Mercer, I see no remorse, only strategy. You hid behind others and called it guidance. You manipulated a citizen into abusing her authority, knowing full well she didn't understand the law. For that, I sentence you to 1 year in county jail, suspended after 6 months, a fine of $20,000, and permanent prohibition from any consulting role related to community governance. Mercer nodded stiffly, eyes fixed on the floor. For once, the man had no script left. When it was over, the courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters whispered outside. Flashbulbs flickered through the windows. I stayed behind for a moment, alone in the pews. The judge was gathering his papers when he looked up. Mr. Graves, he said, you ever think about switching benches? I smiled. No, Your Honor. I like my desk better, fewer microphones. He nodded, then added, almost quietly, what you did here, it's why the law still means something. Then he left the room, robe swaying like a slow black wave. I walked outside into the bright winter air. The courthouse steps were slick with melted snow. Across the street, Karen stood beside her attorney, visor back on, chin trembling. She looked smaller than ever, like a blueprint of authority someone forgot to finish coloring in. She saw me watching and turned away. I didn't say anything. Justice doesn't need an encore. The first time I saw Karen Whitmore after the trial, she wasn't wearing a visor. She was wearing an orange safety vest and holding a rake. It was early March. The snow had started to retreat from the pines, leaving behind that raw smell of thawed earth and wood smoke. I'd driven up to the lake to check on the cabin, a habit I hadn't shaken even after everything. And there she was, bent over a pile of branches near the trailhead, surrounded by a half-dozen other people in matching vests. The state park's trail crew. Her community service sentence. She didn't notice me at first. She was too busy trying to start the chainsaw, pulling the cord again and again, face red from the effort. When it finally roared to life, she nearly dropped it. The supervisor, a man who looked like he'd been cutting trees since birth, pointed toward a fallen log. Karen hesitated, then lifted the saw. The visor might have shielded her from sunlight once, but nothing could shield her from irony now. I watched from the parking lot for a minute, sipping coffee from my thermos. Not out of spite, out of completion. After a while, she looked up and saw me. For a long beat, neither of us moved. The wind pushed between us, cold and clean. Then she set the saw down and started walking over. Slow, cautious steps, the gravel crunching under her boots. When she got close enough, she stopped and said quietly, "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I shook my head. "No, I don't take joy in wreckage." She exhaled, long and shaky. "They said you'd be here, checking on your cabin." "Old habits," I said. "Besides, someone's got to make sure the trails stay clear." She almost smiled at that, but didn't. Her eyes were tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not angry, not defiant, just emptied out. "I never wanted it to go that far," she said finally. "You ever notice how people only say that after it does?" She lowered her gaze. "I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping order." I looked out toward the lake. The ice was breaking apart in slow, shining sheets. "Order's a fine thing," I said, "but it isn't yours to own." She didn't reply, just nodded, once, then turned back toward her crew. The chainsaw started again, louder this time, steadier. For the first time, she was following a rule she didn't write. I stayed for a while longer, watching the sunlight crawl down the trees. There was something peaceful about the sound of work done for real. No clipboards, no measurements, no slogans, just effort. Before leaving, I walked down to the cabin. The bullet hole in the window was still there. I'd never fixed it. Maybe I didn't want to. It reminded me of the difference between peace and quiet. Quiet can be forced. Peace has to be earned. Inside, the air smelled the same as always. Cedar, coffee, and the faint mineral scent of cold metal. The owl was back under the eaves. I poured a cup, sat by the stove, and listened to the lake cracking itself free. Sometimes people ask me if I forgave her. I tell them forgiveness isn't the point. Accountability is. Forgiveness is personal. Justice is public. And if you do it right, one makes room for the other. Karen didn't ruin my peace. She just reminded me how fragile it was. That's the real lesson of places like Raven's Hollow. It's never about property lines. It's about boundaries of decency, the invisible kind people cross when they mistake power for purpose. A week later, a letter arrived at my office. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "I finished my first week on the trail crew. My hands hurt. I don't think I've ever been this tired. Maybe that's what real work feels like. No apology, just honesty." And somehow, that felt like enough. Spring came early that year. By April, the loons were back, calling across the thawed lake like nothing had ever gone wrong. The pines dripped with new sap, the air sharp with resin and meltwater. I stacked fresh firewood, brewed coffee, and watched sunlight pool on the floorboards. Somewhere behind me, a branch cracked. Maybe Karen, maybe someone else on the crew. Didn't matter. The sound blended with the rest of the world, natural again. I leaned back in the chair, the mug warm in my hands, and looked out through that little bullet hole in the glass. One flake of snow drifted through, slow and lazy, landing right in the coffee. I smiled. It hissed, melted, disappeared. That's the thing about peace. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask permission. It just arrives, when you finally stopped mistaking silence for surrender. And when it does, you recognize it, because this time it stays.